In less than 24 hours, Sarah Chen would go from an invisible executive assistant to the most hunted woman in New York City. All it took was one envelope, sealed, anonymous, and meant for hands far more dangerous than hers. She should have walked away. Instead, she opened it and uncovered a secret powerful enough to bring down empires. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor like an army of angry spirits demanding entry. Each drop exploded against the glass in a percussion symphony that had been Sarah Chen's only companion for the past 3 hours. The city sprawled below her, a glittering maze of ambition and broken dreams, while she sat bathed in the pale blue glow of her monitor, her fingers dancing across keys that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She shouldn't have been there. The quarterly reports for the Henderson account could have waited until morning. Hell, they could have waited until next week. But Sarah had always been a perfectionist, a trait that had both elevated her to the position of executive assistant to one of America's most powerful CEOs and trapped her in a prison of her own making. Marcus Hartwell didn't just expect excellence, he demanded it with the quiet intensity of a man who had never heard the word no and never intended to. The Hartwell Industries building was a monument to corporate ambition, its steel and glass facade reflecting the dreams of thousands who worked within its walls. But at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, it felt more like a mausoleum. The only sounds were the whisper of the climate control system and the distant hum of the city 42 floors below. Even the security desk in the lobby felt like another world entirely. Sarah stretched her neck, feeling the familiar knot of tension that had taken permanent residence between her shoulder blades. 3 years of working for Marcus Hartwell had taught her many things. How to read his moods from the way he held his coffee cup, how to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, and how to maintain the perfect balance between professional competence and personal invisibility that his type of man required. What she hadn't learned was how to ignore the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the empire she helped maintain. It had started small, phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room, meetings that weren't on his official calendar, visitors who used the private elevator and never appeared in the security logs. Marcus had always been secretive, but lately, his paranoia had reached new heights. He'd had his office swept for bugs twice in the past month, changed his phone number 3 times, and started paying for things in cash that had always been handled by corporate accounts. The elevator chimed softly behind her, and Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. The sound cut through the silence like a scream in a church. Nobody else should be here. The cleaning crew didn't arrive until midnight, and the night security guard never left his post in the lobby. Her reflection in the rain-streaked window showed a pale, sharp-featured woman with intelligent dark eyes that had seen too much and asked too few questions. Behind her, the elevator doors slid open with the whisper of expensive machinery. "Working late again, Ms. Chen?" Marcus Hartwell's voice cut through the silence like a blade drawn across silk. Even in the darkness, she could feel his presence, imposing, calculated, dangerous in ways that went far beyond his billion-dollar net worth and the power that came with it. Sarah's hands froze above the keyboard. She'd heard that voice deliver speeches to shareholders, charm senators at dinner parties, and reduce grown men to stammering apologies with nothing more than a change in tone. Tonight, it carried something she'd never heard before: uncertainty. "Just finishing the Henderson account projections, Mr. Hartwell," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. She didn't turn around, but she could see his reflection in the window. Tall, imposing, his usually pristine Armani suit slightly disheveled, his silver hair catching the light from the hallway in a way that made him look older than his 53 years. Good. Very good. His footsteps were muffled by the thick Persian carpet as he walked toward his office. But Sarah could hear something else in his gait. Hesitation, maybe even fear. "When you're done, please come see me. There's something we need to discuss." Sarah's stomach clenched like a fist. In 3 years of working as his executive assistant, Marcus had never asked to see her this late. Their relationship was built on predictability. He arrived at 7 a.m. sharp. She had his coffee ready and his schedule organized, and by 6 p.m. he was either in his penthouse apartment or at one of his exclusive clubs. This deviation from routine felt like a crack in the foundation of everything she thought she knew about her carefully ordered world. She watched his reflection disappear into his office, and for a moment she considered gathering her things and leaving. Her apartment in Brooklyn was small but comfortable. Her cat, Mr. Whiskers, would be wondering where she was, and she had a date with a documentary about serial killers and a glass of wine that suddenly seemed infinitely more appealing than whatever conversation awaited her behind Marcus's door. But curiosity, that fatal flaw that had gotten her into trouble since childhood, kept her rooted to her chair. Sarah had always been drawn to mysteries, to the spaces between what people said and what they meant. It was what made her good at her job, reading the subtext in Marcus's meetings, anticipating the needs he didn't voice, managing the complicated web of relationships that kept Hartwell Industries running. But it was also what had cost her a marriage, several friendships, and more than one job before she'd learned to channel her nosiness into professional success. 20 minutes later, after she'd triple-checked the Henderson projections and sent them to the appropriate departments, Sarah knocked on Marcus's door. The sound echoed in the empty hallway like a gunshot. "Come in." Marcus sat behind his mahogany desk, but everything about the scene was wrong. His hands, which usually moved with surgical precision, whether he was signing documents or gesturing during presentations, were trembling slightly. There was a wild look in his eyes that she'd never seen before, like a man who had just seen his own death written in the stars. On his desk lay a manila envelope, thick and unmarked, positioned exactly in the center of his blotter, like an offering on an altar. The office itself seemed different too. The awards and photographs that usually lined the walls appeared to loom over them, and the city lights visible through the windows cast strange shadows across the room. Even the air felt heavier, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a thunderstorm. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me. Something that requires absolute discretion." His voice was lower than usual, and he kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. She nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "Of course, Mr. Hartwell. What do you need?" "I need you to deliver this envelope to a man named Victor Kozlov. He'll be at the Meridian Hotel, room 1247. Tomorrow night, 11 p.m. exactly. You cannot be late. You cannot look inside, and you cannot tell anyone about this, ever." The name Victor Kozlov sent a chill down her spine like ice water in her veins. She'd heard whispers about him in the financial circles she moved through. A Russian businessman with connections to people who made other people disappear. A man who had built his fortune on the bones of his enemies and the silence of his friends. The kind of man who appeared in newspaper obituaries but never in criminal courts. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm not sure I'm comfortable." "Sarah." He stood up abruptly, and she could see that his shirt was damp with sweat despite the office's perfect climate control. "I wouldn't ask if there was any other way, but I need someone I can trust, and you're the only person in this building who fits that description." She wanted to ask questions, 1,000 of them, but the desperation in his voice stopped her cold. Instead, she reached for the envelope, her fingers brushing against his as she took it. His skin was ice cold, and she could feel the slight tremor in his hands. "Of course, Mr. Hartwell. Is there anything else?" "No. Go home. Get some rest. And Sarah?" He looked up at her, and in that moment, she saw something that shook her to her core. Fear. Marcus Hartwell, the man who had stared down senators and CEOs, who had built an empire from nothing and crushed his competitors with the casual efficiency of a man swatting flies, was terrified. "Yes, sir? If anything happens to me, destroy that envelope. Don't deliver it. Don't open it. Burn it, and forget this conversation ever happened." Sarah left the office with more questions than answers, the envelope burning like a coal in her purse. But as she waited for the elevator, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The security camera's red light blinked at her from the corner like a malevolent eye, and she wondered who else might be interested in Marcus Hartwell's midnight meetings and mysterious envelopes. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding that seemed to echo forever in the empty hallway. Sarah stepped inside, and as the doors began to close, she caught a glimpse of a figure in the hallway, tall, wearing a dark coat, face obscured by shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The figure raised a hand, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought it was waving at her. But when the elevator reached the ground floor and she looked back up through the glass lobby, the 42nd floor was dark and empty, as if the entire conversation had been nothing more than a fever dream. The envelope felt heavier with each step toward the parking garage, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was carrying something far more dangerous than documents or money. Whatever was inside that envelope, whatever Marcus Hartwell was so afraid of, she was now part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. As she drove home through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to deliver that envelope blind. She was going to find out exactly what Victor Kozlov wanted, what Marcus Hartwell was hiding, and why a man who owned half the city was scared enough to trust his deepest secrets to a secretary from Brooklyn. She had no idea that by morning, that decision would make her the most dangerous person in New York City. Sarah's hands shook as she held the steam from her coffee mug over the envelope's sealed edge. The technique was something she'd learned from a crime documentary, one of many she'd binged during countless sleepless nights in her Brooklyn apartment. She'd never imagined she'd actually use it. The clock on her kitchen wall read 2:47 a.m. She'd been staring at the manila envelope for 3 hours, turning it over in her hands, feeling its weight, studying the way Marcus had written Victor Kozlov's name in his precise, angular handwriting. The paper was expensive, not the standard office supply store variety, but something heavier, more substantial, the kind of paper reserved for documents that mattered. Mr. Whiskers watched her from his perch on the windowsill, his green eyes reflecting the city lights that never truly went dark. Even her cat seemed to sense that something was wrong. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in with each passing minute. Sarah had always prided herself on being practical, on following rules and maintaining boundaries. But tonight, those boundaries felt like prison bars. The steam worked its magic slowly, loosening the adhesive with surgical precision. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she carefully lifted the flap, half expecting alarms to sound or Marcus to materialize in her kitchen like an avenging angel. But there was only silence, broken by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren wailing through the concrete canyons of Brooklyn. Inside the envelope were photographs. Black and white, grainy, but clear enough to make Sarah's blood run cold. The first showed Marcus Hartwell shaking hands with a man she didn't recognize, elderly, wearing an expensive suit, his face marked by the kind of scars that spoke of violence survived rather than accidents endured. The timestamp in the corner read 3 months ago. The second photograph made her stomach lurch. The same elderly man, but now he was lying in what appeared to be a warehouse, his expensive suit torn and bloodied, his eyes staring sightlessly at the camera. The timestamp was 2 weeks later, but it was the third photograph that made Sarah drop her coffee mug, sending hot liquid splashing across her hardwood floor. Marcus Hartwell stood over the body, holding what looked like a leather briefcase, his face illuminated by the harsh flash of the camera. His expression was cold, calculating, nothing like the terrified man she'd seen in his office hours earlier. There were documents, too, bank records showing wire transfers to offshore accounts, each one bearing Marcus's digital signature. Names and addresses of people she didn't recognize, but whose photos were also in the envelope, some alive, some very clearly dead. A detailed timeline of meetings, payments, and what appeared to be a systematic campaign of elimination. Sarah's hands trembled as she spread the contents across her kitchen table. The picture that emerged was of a man she thought she knew, her boss, her mentor, the person who had given her opportunities she'd never dreamed of, revealing himself to be something far more sinister. Marcus Hartwell wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a killer. The final document was a letter written in Marcus's handwriting on his personal stationery. It was addressed to Viktor Kozlov, and its contents made everything crystal clear. Victor, the situation has become untenable. Senator Morrison's investigation is getting too close, and I fear our arrangement may be exposed. I'm prepared to offer you the same terms we discussed for the others, $50 million for your silence, with the understanding that certain problems will disappear permanently. However, I want you to know that I have comprehensive documentation of our entire relationship, including photographs and financial records. Should anything happen to me, this information will be released to the FBI, the press, and Senator Morrison's committee. I trust you understand the delicate nature of our mutual assured destruction. Monsieur Hartwell Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Marcus wasn't just trying to pay off Viktor Kozlov, he was trying to establish a standoff, a guarantee that neither man would destroy the other. But something had gone wrong. The terror she'd seen in Marcus's eyes, the way he'd asked her to destroy the envelope if anything happened to him, suggested that Kozlov had rejected the arrangement, which meant that Marcus Hartwell, billionaire CEO and apparently prolific killer, was now a marked man. Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. A text message from an unknown number. Did you enjoy the reading material? Her blood turned to ice. Someone was watching her. Someone knew she'd opened the envelope. She looked toward her windows, but the curtains were drawn tight. Her hands shook as she typed back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "Someone who knows what you know. We need to talk. Tomorrow. Central Park, near the Shakespeare Garden, 3 p.m. Come alone, or your boss won't live to see the weekend." Sarah stared at the phone screen until the words blurred. She was in deeper than she'd ever imagined possible. Not only had she discovered that her boss was a murderer, but now she was being drawn into whatever web of violence and blackmail had ensnared him. But as the shock began to wear off, something else took its place. Not fear, though there was plenty of that, but opportunity. Sarah had always been ambitious, had always wanted more than her modest salary and small apartment could provide. She'd watched Marcus build his empire, had seen the power that came with real money, had dreamed of what she could accomplish with those kinds of resources. Now she held the key to everything Marcus had built. The photographs, the documents, the evidence of crimes that would not only destroy him but could potentially bring down dozens of other powerful people. It was dangerous knowledge, but it was also incredibly valuable. Sarah spent the next hour researching Viktor Kozlov online, using every trick she'd learned during her journalism degree that she'd never put to use. What she found painted a picture of a man who had built his fortune on the bones of the Soviet Union's collapse, who had connections to politicians, criminals, and businessmen across 3 continents. A man who collected secrets the way other people collected art, and who had never hesitated to use those secrets to destroy anyone who stood in his way. But she also found something else: reports of Kozlov's declining health, rumors of a power struggle within his organization, suggestions that the aging kingpin was losing his grip on the empire he'd built. If Marcus was right about Kozlov wanting him dead, it might be because the Russian was tying up loose ends before his own inevitable demise. By 4 a.m., Sarah had made her decision. She carefully photographed every document, every image, uploading them to 3 different cloud storage accounts with different passwords. Then she resealed the envelope, using a technique she'd learned from the same documentary that had taught her how to open it. If anyone examined it closely, they might notice the tampering, but a casual inspection would reveal nothing. She would keep her appointment with the mysterious texter, but she wouldn't go empty-handed. And she wouldn't go as Marcus Hartwell's loyal secretary either. She would go as someone who had her own agenda, her own demands, and her own understanding of how the game was played. The envelope sat on her kitchen table like a ticking bomb, but Sarah no longer saw it as a burden. She saw it as her ticket to a different life, one where she held the power, where she made the rules, where she never had to watch other people live the life she wanted while she took notes and made appointments. As the sun began to rise over Brooklyn, painting her apartment in shades of gold and amber, Sarah Chen began to plan her transformation from secretary to player in the most dangerous game she'd ever encountered. She had no idea that by the time the sun set again, she would be running for her life, and that the secret she'd discovered would make her the target of forces far more dangerous than she could possibly imagine. But for now, in the quiet of her apartment with her cat purring on the windowsill and the city waking up below, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the intoxicating rush of holding someone else's fate in her hands. The envelope was no longer Marcus Hartwell's secret. It was her weapon, her leverage, and her chance to rewrite the rules of a game that had been rigged against her from the beginning. Tomorrow she would find out just how deadly that game could be. The Shakespeare Garden in Central Park was a maze of literary references and hidden corners, the perfect place for a conversation that couldn't be overheard. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, her nerves stretched tight as violin strings. She'd spent the morning crafting her strategy, rehearsing what she would say, how she would position herself not as a victim, but as a player in whatever game was being played around Marcus Hartwell's empire of secrets. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the distant promise of winter. Tourists moved in predictable patterns around the garden, their voices a comforting background hum that would mask any conversation. Sarah had chosen a bench near the bronze plaques dedicated to Hamlet, finding a grim appropriateness in the prince's famous soliloquy about the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. She'd dressed carefully, professional but not submissive, confident but not threatening. The manila envelope sat in her leather messenger bag, along with a digital recorder she'd purchased that morning and a small canister of pepper spray that she hoped she wouldn't need. Her phone was set to automatically upload a video to the cloud if she didn't check in every hour, a precaution that felt both paranoid and woefully inadequate. At exactly 3 p.m., a woman approached her bench. Not the intimidating criminal Sarah had been expecting, but someone who looked like she could have been Sarah's older sister, mid-30s, auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a charcoal gray suit that spoke of expensive taste and comfortable money. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been afraid of anything in her life. "Ms. Chen?" The woman's voice carried a slight accent Sarah couldn't quite place. "I'm Detective Elena Vasquez. I think we need to talk." Sarah's carefully prepared speech died in her throat. "Detective? May I sit?" Without waiting for an answer, Vasquez settled onto the bench beside her. "I imagine you're confused right now. You opened an envelope you weren't supposed to open, discovered things you weren't supposed to discover, and now you're wondering if you're in over your head. I don't know what you're talking about." The lie came automatically, but even as she spoke, Sarah knew it was pointless. This woman, this detective, knew everything. Vasquez smiled, and it wasn't entirely friendly. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you because we don't have time for games. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I'm with a joint task force investigating organized crime connections to legitimate businesses. We've been watching Marcus Hartwell for 18 months, and we know about the envelope, about Viktor Kozlov, and about the very dangerous position you've put yourself in." Sarah's mind raced. "You're the one who sent the text?" "Guilty." Vasquez pulled out her own phone, showing Sarah the message thread. "We've had surveillance on your apartment since you started working for Hartwell. We know you opened the envelope at 2:47 a.m. We know you photographed the contents. And we know you've been researching Viktor Kozlov since 4 a.m. The blood drained from Sarah's face. "You've been watching me for 3 years? Not watching. Protecting." "Sarah, Marcus Hartwell isn't just a businessman with a few shady connections. He's the American point of contact for one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the world. The people in those photographs? They're not just dead. They were eliminated because they threatened to expose a network that spans 3 continents and involves billions of dollars in illegal activities." Sarah felt the world shift around her, like the ground had turned to quicksand. "Then why haven't you arrested him?" "Because we need him alive and functional."
Hartwell is our only way inside an organization that makes the traditional mafia look like a neighborhood watch group. If we arrest him now, We lose access to information that could prevent thousands of deaths and dismantle criminal networks that have been operating for decades. The detective reached into her jacket and pulled out a folder. These are photographs of people who tried to blackmail Viktor Kozlov or his associates.
Would you like to see what happened to them? Sarah shook her head, but Vasquez opened the folder anyway. The images were horrific. Bodies that had been tortured, mutilated, displayed as warnings to others who might consider similar actions. Sarah's stomach lurched, and she had to look away. The envelope you're carrying, Vasquez continued, was supposed to be Hartwell's insurance policy, but Kozlov rejected his offer, which means your boss is now a dead man walking. The only question is whether you're going to die with him. What do you want from me? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. We want you to deliver the envelope exactly as Hartwell instructed, but we want you to do it wearing a wire, and we want you to follow our script instead of whatever amateur blackmail scheme you've been cooking up. Sarah stared at the detective. You want me to walk into a meeting with a Russian crime boss while wearing a wire? We want you to help us save your life and potentially hundreds of others. Sarah, you're not the first person to stumble into this situation, but you could be the first to survive it if you're smart about how you proceed. The detective's phone buzzed, and her expression darkened as she read the message. We have a problem. Hartwell never showed up at his office today. His security team found his apartment empty, but there were signs of a struggle. We think Kozlov's people have him. Sarah's blood turned to ice. What does that mean for me? It means the timeline just accelerated. Kozlov will want that envelope now, and he'll use whatever means necessary to get it. He knows Hartwell had an assistant, and he knows you have access to his files. It's only a matter of time before he comes looking for you. As if summoned by her words, Sarah's phone rang. Unknown number. Vasquez nodded, and Sarah answered with shaking hands. Ms. Chen. The voice was heavily accented, gravelly with age and cigarettes. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I don't know what you're talking about. Please do not insult my intelligence. Your employer made certain arrangements with me, and I require the materials he promised to deliver. You will bring them to me tonight, or I will be forced to collect them in a manner that will be unpleasant for you. Sarah looked at Vasquez, who was already signaling to someone Sarah couldn't see. Where? The Meridian Hotel, room 1247, 11 p.m., exactly as your employer planned. Come alone, Ms. Chen, and do not disappoint me the way Mr. Hartwell did. The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, then at the detective beside her. Congratulations, Vasquez said grimly. You're now officially bait in a trap we've been setting for 2 years. The question is whether you're going to be live bait or dead bait. What happened to Marcus? Honestly, he's probably already dead. Kozlov doesn't like to be kept waiting, and he especially doesn't like people who try to outmaneuver him. But there's a chance, a small one, that he's keeping Hartwell alive until he gets those documents. Sarah felt tears threatening but forced them back. What do you need me to do? Vasquez stood up, her expression all business. First, you're going to come with me to a safe house where we can properly prepare you for tonight. Then you're going to walk into that hotel room and convince Viktor Kozlov that you're just a terrified secretary who wants to deliver the envelope and disappear. What you're not going to do is try to negotiate, try to be clever, or try to turn this into some kind of business opportunity. And if something goes wrong, then you'll join your boss in whatever afterlife awaits people who play games with the devil. Vasquez's smile was thin and humorless. But if everything goes right, you'll help us take down one of the most dangerous men in the world, and you'll get to live to tell about it. As they walked away from the Shakespeare Garden, Sarah caught sight of the bronze plaque she'd been sitting near. Hamlet's words seemed to follow her. To be or not to be, that is the question. But Sarah was beginning to understand that the question wasn't whether to be or not to be. It was whether she would be herself or become something else entirely. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking away from the last normal moment of her life. Behind her, tourists continued their predictable patterns, unaware that they had just witnessed a secretary's transformation into something far more dangerous. By tonight, Sarah Chen would either be dead or she would be the woman who helped bring down Viktor Kozlov. There was no middle ground, no safe space between those two possibilities. The game had begun, and Sarah was about to discover that the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. The safe house was a nondescript apartment in Queens, the kind of place that looked like it had been furnished by someone with no imagination and a tight budget. Sarah sat in a hard plastic chair while a technician named Rodriguez worked to attach a wire so small it looked like a piece of thread. The device would transmit everything she said to a surveillance van parked 3 blocks from the Meridian Hotel, but Sarah took little comfort in knowing help was nearby. The wire has a range of about 500 meters in ideal conditions, Rodriguez explained, his fingers working with practiced precision. But hotel walls, especially in older buildings like the Meridian, can interfere with the signal. If we lose contact, you'll be on your own. Detective Vasquez paced the small living room, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated with what sounded like a dozen different agencies. Sarah had counted at least 15 people who had passed through the apartment in the past 4 hours, FBI agents, local police, and several individuals whose affiliations remained mysteriously unclear. The important thing, Vasquez said as she ended her call, is that you don't try to be a hero. You walk in, you hand over the envelope, and you walk out. No questions, no curiosity, no attempts to gather additional information. Sarah nodded, but her mind was racing. What if he asks questions about Marcus? What if he wants to know things I don't know? Then you tell him the truth, that you're just the secretary, that Hartwell kept you in the dark about his business dealings, and that you're scared out of your mind. All of which happens to be true. A new voice spoke from the doorway. Actually, none of that is true anymore. Sarah turned to see a man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the shabby apartment. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the kind of authority that made everyone else in the room straighten up slightly. "Agent Morrison," Vasquez said, and Sarah caught the note of deference in her voice. "I thought you were coordinating from headquarters." "Plans change." Morrison's eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Ms. Chen, I'm afraid we haven't been entirely honest with you about your situation." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Viktor Kozlov didn't just randomly choose to target Marcus Hartwell. He's been systematically eliminating everyone connected to a specific operation that took place 3 years ago, right around the time you started working for Hartwell. "I don't understand." Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed her a photograph. It was Marcus, but younger, standing next to a man she didn't recognize in what looked like a warehouse. This was taken in Moscow 3 years ago. "Your boss was involved in an operation to steal financial records from several Russian oligarchs. The information was supposed to be used to freeze their assets and cripple their operations." Sarah stared at the image. "What does this have to do with me?" The operation was blown. Someone leaked the details to Kozlov, and instead of the Americans getting the information, the Russians got a list of everyone involved in the plot. They've been working through that list ever since, eliminating targets one by one. Vasquez stepped forward. "Sarah, we don't think you're just Marcus's secretary. We think you're the leak." The room went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Sarah felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. "That's impossible. I don't know anything about any operation in Moscow. I've never even been to Russia." "You don't have to have been to Russia to work for the Russians," Morrison said coldly. "Your financial records show several deposits over the past 3 years that don't match your salary. Your internet search history shows suspicious patterns, and your access to Hartwell's files and schedule would have made you extremely valuable to foreign intelligence." Sarah stood up so quickly that the chair fell backward. "You're insane. I'm not a spy. I'm a secretary from Brooklyn who watches too many crime documentaries and can't afford to eat anything but ramen half the time." Then explain this. Morrison swiped to another screen on his tablet. It showed bank records, her bank records, with deposits she'd never seen before. $50,000, deposited monthly for the past 18 months. These payments are coming from a shell company that traces back to Russian intelligence. Sarah's mind reeled. I've never seen those before. Someone must have what? Hacked into your bank account to make you look guilty. Ms. Chen, the evidence is overwhelming. The question now is whether you're going to cooperate with us, or whether we're going to arrest you for treason. The word hit her like a physical blow. Treason. The kind of charge that meant life in prison, or worse. Sarah looked around the room at the faces surrounding her. Some sympathetic, some suspicious. All of them suddenly looking at her like she was a dangerous animal that might need to be put down. I'm not a traitor, she said quietly. I don't know what's happening here, but I'm not working for the Russians. Vasquez's phone rang, and she answered it with a sharp, "What?" Her expression grew increasingly grim as she listened. We have a problem, she said as she hung up. Kozlov moved the meeting. He's not at the Meridian anymore. Where is he? Morrison demanded. The warehouse district in Queens, Pier 47. He says if Sarah doesn't show up in 2 hours, he's going to start sending pieces of Marcus Hartwell to every major news outlet in the city. Sarah felt the last of her options evaporating. Marcus is still alive? Barely, and he won't be for much longer if we don't move fast. Morrison studied Sarah with calculating eyes. This changes everything. If Kozlov moved the meeting, it means he suspects something. A warehouse gives him too many advantages. Multiple escape routes, no civilians to worry about, and plenty of space for activities we'd rather not contemplate. So what do? We send you in anyway. But now we have to assume that Kozlov knows you're working with us, which means you're walking into a trap. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want me to walk into a trap to save a man who might be a murderer, while you're accusing me of being a Russian spy based on bank records I've never seen? Welcome to the world of international intelligence, Morrison said dryly. Nothing is ever simple, and everyone is lying about something. Rodriguez finished attaching the wire and stepped back. You're good to go. But remember, if the signal cuts out, we can't help you. Vasquez handed Sarah a small device that looked like a car key fob. GPS tracker. Press the button if you need immediate extraction. We'll come in guns blazing, but it'll probably be too late to save you. Comforting, Sarah muttered. As she prepared to leave, Morrison pulled her aside. Ms. Chen, I want you to consider the possibility that you're not who you think you are. What's that supposed to mean? Sometimes people are recruited without knowing it. Sometimes they're given false memories, false identities, false lives. The woman you think you are, Sarah Chen, secretary from Brooklyn, might be a cover story you've been living for so long that you've forgotten it's not real. Sarah stared at him. You're suggesting I'm some kind of sleeper agent who doesn't know she's a sleeper agent? I'm suggesting that nothing about your situation makes sense unless you're something more than what you appear to be. And in about 90 minutes, you're going to walk into a room with one of the most dangerous men in the world, and you'd better hope you know which side you're really on. As Sarah left the safe house, her mind churned with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was she really a spy? Was Marcus really a killer? Was any of what she believed about herself actually true? The warehouse district was dark and industrial, full of shadows and the sound of water lapping against concrete. Sarah made her way toward Pier 47, the manila envelope clutched in her hands like a lifeline. Behind her, she could feel the weight of surveillance, agents watching her every move, ready to swoop in if things went wrong. But as she approached the designated meeting point, Sarah began to suspect that things had already gone wrong in ways that none of them had anticipated. The warehouse at Pier 47 was too quiet, too empty, the kind of quiet that preceded violence, the kind of emptiness that suggested a trap within a trap. Sarah was about to discover that everyone, the FBI, the Russians, and possibly even herself, had been playing a game where the rules kept changing, and where the only constant was that nothing was what it seemed. The envelope in her hands might contain the evidence to destroy Viktor Kozlov, but it might also contain the key to her own destruction. And in a few minutes, she would finally learn which it was. The warehouse at Pier 47 stood like a monument to industrial decay, its broken windows reflecting the harbor lights in fractured patterns. Sarah's footsteps echoed on the wet concrete as she approached the entrance, the manila envelope clutched against her chest like armor that she knew would provide no protection against what waited inside. The door was already open, hanging on rusted hinges that creaked in the harbor wind. Sarah stepped into the darkness, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it could be heard over the wire she wore. The space was vast, filled with shadows and the smell of salt water and rust. "Ms. Chen." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the concrete walls. "Please, come forward. We have much to discuss." Sarah walked deeper into the warehouse, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the broken windows. At the far end of the space, she could make out figures arranged around what looked like a table. As she drew closer, the scene became clearer and more horrifying. Marcus Hartwell sat in a chair, his expensive suit torn and bloodied, his face bearing the marks of violence. He was alive but barely conscious, his head lolling to one side. Standing behind him was a man Sarah recognized from the photographs, Viktor Kozlov, older than she'd expected, leaning heavily on a walking stick, his eyes sharp with intelligence and cruelty. But it was the third figure that made Sarah's blood run cold. Detective Elena Vasquez stood beside Kozlov, no longer wearing her professional suit, but dressed in dark clothing that made her blend into the shadows. Her expression was calm, almost bored, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. "Hello, Sarah," Vasquez said with a smile that held no warmth. "I suppose you're wondering why your FBI contact is standing with the Russian crime boss you're supposed to be helping capture." Sarah's mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing. "You're working with him?" "Working with him? Sarah, I am him. Or rather, I work for the organization he represents. Viktor here is what you might call middle management. I'm the one who's been running this operation from the beginning." Kozlov spoke, his accent thick but his English precise. "Your government thinks they are so clever, but they do not understand that we have been inside their operations for years. Detective Vasquez has been feeding us information, manipulating investigations, ensuring that the right people disappear at the right times." Sarah looked at Marcus, who raised his head with obvious effort. "Sarah," he whispered, "don't give them the envelope. Whatever they've told you, whatever they've promised you, don't—" Vasquez backhanded him across the face, and Marcus's head snapped to the side. "Mr. Hartwell forgets his place. He was supposed to be a simple businessman, laundering money and providing legitimate cover for our operations. Instead, he got greedy, started keeping records, taking photographs, building his own little insurance policy." "The envelope," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's really in it?" "Everything," Kozlov replied. "Names, dates, financial records, photographs, not just of our operations, but of the American officials who have been working with us. Senators, judges, CIA directors. Your Mr. Hartwell documented everything, thinking it would protect him. Instead, it made him the most dangerous man in America." Sarah's grip tightened on the envelope. "And you want me to give it to you so you can destroy it?" "Oh, my dear girl," Vasquez laughed. "We don't want to destroy it. We want to use it. Do you have any idea what kind of leverage those documents represent? With that information, we could control American foreign policy for the next decade." "But first," Kozlov said, "we need to address the question of your identity, Ms. Chen. Or should I say, Ms. Volkov." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Images flashed through her mind. Not memories, but fragments of something that felt like memories. A different apartment, a different life, a different name. Training sessions she couldn't quite remember. languages she spoke without knowing how she'd learned them, skills that had always seemed instinctive. "No," she whispered. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm from Brooklyn. I work for Marcus Hartwell." "You are Sarah Chen," Vasquez agreed. "But you're also Svetlana Volkov, and you've been working for us for 3 years." "The bank deposits agent Morrison showed you? Those were payments for services rendered? Every piece of information you gathered from Hartwell's office? Every schedule you passed along? Every security detail you provided? All of it went through you." Sarah's legs felt weak. "I don't remember any of that." "Memory is a funny thing," Kozlov said. "It can be edited, adjusted. We needed someone close to Hartwell, someone who could gather information without suspicion. But we also needed someone who could maintain their cover even under interrogation. A person who genuinely believes they are innocent is much more convincing than someone who is simply a good liar." The pieces were falling into place, but Sarah fought against the picture they formed. "You're saying I'm a spy who doesn't know she's a spy? You're saying I helped you kill all those people in the photographs?" "You provided the information that made it possible," Vasquez said. "But don't worry, you'll never be prosecuted for it. As far as the American legal system is concerned, you're a victim in all this. The perfect patsy." Marcus raised his head again, his eyes focusing on Sarah with obvious effort. "She's lying," he said hoarsely. "Sarah, whatever they've done to you, whatever they've made you believe, you're not one of them. I've watched you for 3 years. I know who you are." "And who am I?" Sarah asked, desperate for any truth in the maze of lies surrounding her. "You're exactly who you think you are," Marcus said. "A woman from Brooklyn who got caught up in something bigger than herself. The bank records, the memories, the training, it's all fake. They've been drugging you, Sarah. Small doses in your coffee, your food, anything you consumed regularly. Enough to make you suggestible, to plant false memories, to make you doubt your own identity." Vasquez's expression darkened. "Enough. Give me the envelope, Sarah. This conversation is over." But Sarah was no longer listening to Vasquez. She was thinking about the coffee she drank every morning, delivered by the same service that handled Marcus's office. The headaches she'd been having, the strange dreams, the feeling that she was forgetting something important. The documentary binges that had started 3 years ago, right when she'd begun working for Marcus, as if her subconscious was trying to tell her something about the world of crime and espionage she'd been pulled into. "You've been poisoning me," she said, the truth clicking into place. "Making me forget, making me doubt myself, making me easier to manipulate." "We've been preparing you," Kozlov corrected, "for this moment. When you hand over that envelope, our operation will be complete. We'll have the leverage we need to control American policy, and you'll have served your purpose." "And then what happens to me?" Vasquez smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Sarah had ever seen. "Then you have an accident, a break-in gone wrong, perhaps. Or maybe you'll be so overcome with guilt about betraying your country that you'll take your own life. We haven't decided yet." Sarah looked at the envelope in her hands, then at Marcus, who was watching her with eyes that held a mixture of hope and desperation. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago, ambitious, curious, determined to make something of herself. That woman wouldn't have gone quietly into the darkness. "I have a better idea," Sarah said. Before anyone could react, she tore open the envelope and scattered its contents across the warehouse floor. Photographs fluttered in the harbor wind, documents spread like fallen leaves, and the carefully constructed blackmail scheme that had consumed so many lives lay in ruins at their feet. "You stupid girl," Kozlov snarled, raising his walking stick as if to strike her. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" "I've leveled the playing field," Sarah said. She pulled out her phone and held it up so they could see the screen. "I've been live streaming this entire conversation to 3 different social media platforms. Every word you've said, every threat you've made, every detail about your operation, it's all been broadcast to several thousand people. The color drained from Vasquez's face. "That's impossible. We swept you for electronics. You swept me for traditional wires, but you forgot that modern phones can broadcast on cellular networks that your jammers can't block. Detective Vasquez, meet the digital age." Kozlov was screaming orders in Russian, but Sarah was already moving. She grabbed a flare from an emergency kit mounted on the wall and ignited it, bathing the warehouse in hellish red light. Through the broken windows, she could see vehicles approaching. Real FBI agents, real police, drawn by the GPS tracker she'd activated the moment she'd realized the truth. "Marcus," she called out, cutting his bonds with a piece of broken glass. "Can you walk?" "I can run if I have to," he said, struggling to his feet. Gunfire erupted behind them as Kozlov's men engaged with the arriving federal agents. Sarah and Marcus stumbled through the maze of shipping containers and abandoned machinery, the sound of combat echoing through the harbor. "Sarah," Marcus gasped as they reached the waterfront. "There's something you need to know, about who you really are." She looked at him, this man who had been her boss, her mentor, and possibly her savior. "I know who I am. I'm Sarah Chen from Brooklyn. I watch too many crime documentaries. I can't afford decent food, and I have a cat named Mr. Whiskers, who's probably wondering where I am." Marcus smiled, despite the blood on his face. "And you're also the woman who just brought down one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the world." As police boats surrounded the warehouse and helicopters circled overhead, Sarah realized that she might never know the complete truth about what had happened to her over the past 3 years. But she knew the most important truth of all. She had chosen who she wanted to be, and that choice had made all the difference. The envelope's contents lay scattered across the warehouse floor, but they were no longer the key to anyone's fate. The real power had been in choosing not to use them, in refusing to be a pawn in someone else's game, in remembering that even in a world of lies and manipulation, the truth was still worth fighting for. 6 months later, Sarah Chen would testify before a Senate committee about her experiences. Viktor Kozlov would die in federal custody under suspicious circumstances. Detective Elena Vasquez would disappear entirely, as if she had never existed at all. And Marcus Hartwell would bargain his way to a sentence that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life, but alive long enough to help dismantle dozens of criminal networks. But that night, standing on the pier with the harbor wind in her hair and the sound of justice being served behind her, Sarah Chen was simply a woman from Brooklyn who had discovered that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to be afraid of who you really are.